Hello, and welcome to the Time on Screen podcast. My name is Zach Kazan. I'm the managing editor at Worn and Wound. Time on Screen is a podcast where we look at the connections between time and watches and movies. We've got a really fun Halloween themed episode for you today. We did a Halloween themed episode last year with a horror movie, so we're continuing the tradition. I'm joined by Kat Shoulders, head of content at Worn and Wound. Kat, how's it going?
Great. I'm really excited about this episode.
Yeah, we're talking
And
about.
thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah. No, I mean, we have a bunch of horror movie fans at Worn and Wound. One of the reasons I think I feel so like at home at Worn and Wound is like there's a lot of people to talk about horror movies with.
Yeah.
So yeah, this will be a fun episode. We're talking about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining today.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely like one of my favorite movies of all time. And
Same.
certainly like ranks near the top of like my favorite horror movies ever made. Probably is my favorite horror movie ever.
Yeah.
It's hard to beat. One I like more. And we're also going to talk about Dr. Sleep, the relatively recently released 2019 sequel to The Shining. Very controversial movie, but I know you're a fan of it. I am too. So I think there's like a natural kind of conversation to be had there about both films.
What was the movie y'all did last year for Halloween? I don't remember.
We did a John Carpenter movie. Oh, In the Mouth of Madness.
That's right. That's right.
Which is also another great movie by one of my favorite filmmakers. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes if you want to go back and do like a Halloween time on screen marathon.
Yeah.
Well, not really a marathon. I mean, you'll have like 2 hours of podcasting to listen to. But
I wish, looking back, maybe I wish we would have done like a whole month of Halloween movies, because I love, like, horror is probably my favorite genre besides like maybe a drama, but I just love scary movies. They're great.
Same. I've always loved horror movies. I think the genre is like so expansive. Like there's so many different kinds. There's like a horror movie for like every kind of like mood that you might find yourself in. Yeah. Which I suppose is true for other genres too, but I don't know. There's just something about horror movies that I really enjoy. Before we get into our discussion of The Shining, let's do first of all, blanket spoiler warning for The Shining, for Dr. Sleep, and for the novels The Shining and Dr. Sleep. I think if you these things have been out in the culture for so many years now, I think it's kind of hard to avoid. Knowing about like different plot points and the endings and how the movies and books differ in certain ways, large and small. But we're going to be talking about all of it today. So
go watch
turn
it.
This off if you don't want to hear about the endings of these movies. And let's get a wrist check out of the way. I don't know that we'll be talking about watches so much during this podcast.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But what do you happen to be wearing today, Kat?
I was wearing this yesterday during our podcast recording, but I still have the Fears Collective Redcliffe 39.5 Onyx style. I figured I just bought this watch, so I'm sort of in honeymoon period, but it's got this like deep black dial. Obviously it's made of onyx, and it you kind of just fall into the void of this dial, and I thought it'd be kind of fitting for the movie choice today. Kind of dark.
Black dial horror movies kind of makes sense. I'm wearing the James Lamb Origin series, kind of like the opposite, I guess, of your watch. Very colorful. I don't know if subconsciously I just decided I've been like, kind of focusing on the world of The Shining for like the last like 3 days, kind of like preparing for this podcast, rewatching both movies. Maybe I just wanted like an antidote to all the darkness. But here we are, back into the darkness of The Shining. So let's start off horror movies in general, Kat. What is it about horror movies that it's like so appealing to you? Like, why what about this genre is
oh man, that's a deep question. I don't know. I think we were talking about the fact that there are so many facets of horror, and I think fear to a lot of people is different. It's what I'm fearful of is something different from you and different from someone else, and I think like that's why the genre expands so much, because people have different fears. But I don't know what draws me. I like things that are dark in general. I like things that are sad. Like some of my favorite movies are the saddest movies ever, and I think anything that draws like an emotion out of me that's kind of visceral in nature. And there's certainly movies that I've watched that I've had that reaction of like, holy crap, what did I just see? I can't even make sense of it. Um, and I think there's something about this genre too, where there's typically movies of this nature that I can rewatch over and over again and find like new things in them. And this is certainly one of those movies that I find something new every time I watch it. Same with Doctor Sleep. Maybe that's a kind of a Kubrick thing too, because he does like a lot of details that you don't notice, and then you kind of go back and rewatch. But yeah, I and Flanagan too with Doctor Sleep. But yeah, I find that they're rewatchable to me in a way that I find like a comedy doesn't really suffice, or
Hmm.
some of the happier movies. I just yeah, I like the darkness.
Yeah. I mean,
What about
honestly,
you?
like same. Like I'm kind of like I'm also drawn to sort of to like the darker side of things. I
Yeah.
think to me I love like the versatility of horror as a genre, and how like you can kind of like grow up in movies with horror
Hmm.
and genre movies, of any kind, to a large extent. This is why I love sci-fi movies too, is because they appeal
Yeah.
to like, there's like a childhood appeal, to like
Yeah.
to a genre movie. Like you like seeing like, like blood and guts and gore, or like, that kind of like visceral, like, kind of like scary stuff,
Yeah.
or, like, alien invasion in the sci-fi movie or whatever. But then as you like kind of like grow up and start to kind of like, mature as a film goer, as a movie lover, you understand that like there's all these layers, like underneath sort of like the thrilling aspects and the genre aspects of these things. And I
Yeah.
just love the like the way that different filmmakers sort of like play with those ideas. Like you can enjoy The
I do too.
Shining as a, as like a thrill ride, or as like a, like a really
Yeah.
like dark experience. But there's also like, it's also just like a movie about a family,
Hmm.
and like a movie about alcoholism, and a movie about like the artistic process and writing. And, those are things that you're not going to pick up. At least I didn't pick up when I was like, 12 or 13 or whatever, when
Yeah.
I first saw this movie. But it's like, those are the things I think about now when I watch this movie, like as an adult and someone with a kind of like a larger like film vocabulary.
Yeah.
So,
I also find like a fascination with the unknown too, and I think you
mhm,
get that in a lot of these movies. Especially how a lot of horror movies end is like there is so much unknown about, and so much to question. You can really leave it up to your own like interpretation. And I don't know, I find that like really fascinating, and I kind of like, I'm drawn to it at least.
yeah.
And it's fun. Yeah, they're fun.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it boils down to, is like there's like a certain yeah, they are fun. Like I think a lot of movies kind of ask you to like take them, maybe a little bit too seriously, and like most horror movies, kind of have this like winking attitude about things. And like The Shining honestly might not be the best example of that, because it is, sort of like visceral. But
Yeah.
and like we can talk about sort of like the recent trends in horror movies, and how like
Yeah.
sort of like art horror, like A24 style, is maybe like a
Totally.
little too serious
Yeah.
minded for me sometimes. But then I also think like Hereditary is like a comedy.
Yeah.
So it's,
I was gonna say.
yeah. um
That should
when did you
be
first
we
encounter
have to do an
the
episode on Hereditary at some point.
so
Yeah.
we were going back and forth, and like I asked for your suggestions for this, and like you listed Hereditary. I had actually just listened to a great podcast. The Rewatchables did a podcast on Hereditary, which is like fantastic. We
Okay.
can link to that in the show notes too. But I wanted
Yeah.
to like get some space from that, because I feel
Yeah.
like I would just be like copying
Kinda
the
piggybacking off of it. Yeah, we'll
yeah.
save it for another time.
Maybe that'll be next year's Halloween
Yeah.
movie. I love Hereditary. It's
I do too.
just a really incredible film. Um, when did you first kind of come across The Shining? Like, what was your first experience with this movie?
Yeah, I think, like, my first experience with this movie was I had to have been 6, 7, 8 years old, and,
That's
my
young to
that
take in that.
well, and I won't say I didn't watch the whole thing, but I do remember my parents are both, like, my dad was, big into movies and films, and so is my mom, and like movies were just really big in our house. And so I remember this being on, and like literally me hiding behind the couch and running and just hiding and being really scared of this movie, honestly, until I probably reached my teenage years is when I probably first saw it on my own for the first time. Because it was just one of those movies in the back of my head I was sort of terrified of. And
Yeah.
I think I only actually went back to watch it because it's such a iconic movie. It's referenced in film and television, everywhere.
Hmm.
Um And one of my favorite scenes in a movie, and we should do a time on screen on this. Twisters are
Hmm.
they have a scene, or Twister. I'm sorry, it's Twister, right? This is the first one.
Twister's the original.
Twister, yeah.
Twisters
Twisters is
is
the
the
second. Yeah, I
the
couldn't remember if
recent
it had the
sequel.
S
Yeah.
at the end. Twister, the first one, original. There's a scene that they're at a drive-in, and The Shining is playing, and it's always been iconic to me. And um, yeah, I think I was just drawn to finally sit down and watch it, and yeah, it freaked me out, but I was able to like get through it, obviously.
Yeah.
What about
I came
you?
to this movie when I was, it must have been like, so first of all, I've seen this movie so many. This is probably one of the, like my most rewatched movies,
Yeah,
um, of any movie in my life. But I
you're a
think I
big
probably,
Kubrick fan.
I love Kubrick, and that's
Yeah.
probably how I first kind of like came to it. I would imagine is I was probably like, I was probably like, I don't know, like 12, 13 years old and like try like sort of like developing an interest in film. And I probably like figured I have to watch every Stanley Kubrick movie. That was sort of like my
Yeah,
um, that was like my process when I was that age was like I would like figure out, like who these directors are and then just try to like track down all their movies. So like at some point I hit Kubrick and
totally.
I got to, like 2001 and A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon, which did not make sense to me as when I was like 12. Like that was a slow burn for
Yeah.
sure. And
Eyes Wide Shut.
eyes,
Yeah.
yeah, well, that's another. I saw Eyes Wide Shut in the theater when I was like, I think I was like 16 or something,
Oh
and I was
my
like so
gosh.
excited for it. And I love Eyes Wide Shut. That's another
Yeah.
time on screen. Maybe that'll be like a solo time on screen. I can
Yeah.
just like talk about how much I love Eyes Wide Shut like a sociopath. But yeah, so anyway, like I probably saw this like on DVD, and I was like, 13 or 14 or something, kind of
Yeah.
like budding film lover. And it just really like had an impact on me. And I
Mhm.
remember I had the DVD in like there's a Kubrick box set that Warner Brothers put out. So like it had, all the Warner Brothers Kubrick movies. It had like this and Full Metal Jacket and Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon 2001. I might be missing one, but I just remember like watching it constantly. I would go back to The Shining more than probably any Kubrick movie, and
Yeah.
I don't know that it's like my favorite Kubrick movie, but there's something just really like rewatchable about it, and I think for me it goes back to the performances, the Jack Nicholson performance in
Yeah.
particular. It's just like so exciting to watch him.
I think like this movie it's like if you're someone that's sort of maybe just jumping into the horror genre, and maybe this is kind of how I got into it in my teenage years, because that's when I started really getting into horror. There's kind of like a list you go through right at the beginning, and I think this was just on that list of like must watch horror movies. And you go back and you watch this, and you watch maybe some of the like old Alfred Hitchcock movies. Like they're just kind of a standard where you kind of start at. And yeah, I've always loved it. There's something really magical about this movie, and it really is one of those rewatchable horror films that I never get tired of.
Same, same. So for those of you who need a quick refresher, the really quick and dirty plot summary is basically the Torrance family moves to the Overlook Hotel for the winter. Out of work, teacher slash writer gets a job as caretaker of a hotel, and it's haunted. And the kid has some psychic abilities, and hijinks ensue. I
Yeah,
mean, what else is there to say? There's, it's kind of like a combination of like a haunted house movie
yeah,
with like also like really about like alcoholism and like
hmm,
the King, of course, famously has his own like drinking problem that he's like talked
yeah.
very openly about. And it's like there's an autobiographical element to this.
Undertone, yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it's important to call out like the inspiration for this movie. Stephen King was in Estes Park, Colorado, and him and his wife were passing through. They were on their way to like the Rocky Mountains, but they actually stayed at the Stanley Hotel on the very last night that it was open. They were the only guest at the hotel. They were sort of closing up for the season, which I can imagine was kind of spooky in itself. But here you have this horror writer and his wife staying at the hotel. And King has never spoke about like what if he experienced anything at the hotel, but it was certainly inspiration for the book and the movie. Um, and I can imagine was a pretty spooky night to stay there all alone in those
Yeah,
hallways.
I was kind of like looking back through, sort of like materials on this movie, like prepping for the podcast, and he said that he had been working on a version of this story that was set in like an amusement park
Yeah, I
of
read that
of
too.
some kind,
Yeah.
and then he had this experience, at the Stanley Hotel, and like he said that like the story kind of like settled in his brain like overnight, basically, like he
Mhm.
was up late like thinking about it. Um, One of my favorite kind of like scenes in the movie is the scene where they're kind of like closing down the hotel. It's actually like two scenes,
Yeah.
the interview scene and then the scene later where the
Kinda
family
walk
comes back
through.
and they're really closing things down. And I wanted to ask you, do you think it's harder to close down the Overlook Hotel or wind up New York City?
That's great. Oh man, my back would argue that it's harder to close down windup. It definitely
You have to
takes
do
some
wind up in like 4 hours. Like
I
it
think
seems
they
like
have
at the
more
Overlook, you've got
people.
like a
The
week or so
hotel
to.
has more people. Yeah, they have like
Yeah.
a whole week. It's, a gradual change. Yeah, it's so much easier to close down the Stanley or the Overlook.
Yeah. Even with, the haunted element, I think it's
Yeah.
probably, a little bit easier. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think this is one of the reasons the movie kind of like has this like enduring appeal, is, um, like I think like a lot of people would kind of like to do this.
It's
There's
a
something
really cool
appealing about
job.
kind of like
Yeah.
having a hotel like all to yourself for like the entire winter. And I wanted to ask if you take out all the murder and all of the,
Yeah.
all the alcoholism and all the terrible things that are happening in the Overlook, like is this something you'd be up for doing? Like it kind of.
Absolutely. I kind of like the isolation roles and jobs, and I think it would be really cool to do. I used to want to be like a park ranger where I was just solo driving around a national park by myself, and I could totally, yeah, I would totally sign up for this. Um Even with the murders, I would sign up for it.
Even with the murders. Okay, well, geez, I
Yeah.
wasn't expecting you to say that. I definitely don't want to be involved in a murder hotel operation. But I do think that there's something. I mean, like I live in New Hampshire. Like every
Yeah.
winter, there's a like a storm or two where you're actually like snowed in and you're kind of like
Yeah.
trapped. And like there is something that's sort of kind of like nice about that. Like you're just kind of
Mhm.
like left to your own devices, and you have to kind of entertain yourself and you know, or problem solve or whatever. And like I think
Yeah.
that this movie kind of like appeals to that part of my brain that's like,
Yeah.
um, it's like it's kind of fun to be like snowed in. And like this family has fun for like
A little while.
a little bit
Yeah.
before things start to kind of like go off the rails.
Yeah, it's a long winter. I'm kind of curious if the Overlook Hotel still closes because as we heard through Stephen King's story, they were there the last night, and I know that that hotel doesn't close anymore because they have access to get into the park and into the city. There's just more, roads, and there's more. I guess technology has changed with what do you call it, like snow plows and things like
Sure.
that. I would imagine that the Overlook doesn't even close anymore for the season, because they can make more money if they stay open, and
Yeah, I would.
there's more. I think there's more means now to keep the roads open through the
Yeah,
winter.
you stayed at the Stanley Hotel at one point, right?
I
You so
did,
can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about your experience there? What was it like to
Yeah,
actually.
so I've done a couple visits up to Estes Park, which is where the Stanley Hotel is. It's a really cool historical town. There's a lot of history there. It is literally right at the entrance of Rocky Mountain National Park. You can see it because the hotel does sort of sit on a hill. You can see the national park there in your view. And um, the first time we went, we were just there visiting. We did the whole like haunted tour, which was great. And there's been a bunch of movies filmed there. Dumb and Dumber was filmed there, and apparently Jim Carrey had a spooky experience himself at the hotel. But it is sort of spooky. It looks nothing like the movie. It's very
Yeah.
very different inside, but equally as eerie. It's much smaller in nature. It's I think the Overlook, or the stage that they built for the inside of the Overlook, is very grand.
Hmm.
This hotel doesn't have sort of that grandeur, but it is really kind of creepy. There's like patterned carpeted floors that they
Hmm.
still have, and long hallways with lots of rooms and spiral staircases that are really cool. But we were coming back through there on our 2-week trip that we were overlanding, and we were coming through Estes Park, and we're like, well, we have to stay there. And I was just saying this on the other podcast, but my biggest regret is when they asked us like if we wanted a room that had some sort of paranormal activity that had happened in the past or other guests have experienced, or if we just wanted to stay on like the newer side of the hotel, which was fine and new. And we decided on the newer side. And I was
Yeah.
like, such a big regret that we didn't um, stay on the side that had like creepy stuff that happened. Cause that would have been a really great story to have experienced something at that hotel. But I have to go back and, I'll have to stay at a spooky room.
It's still a pretty good story. So they filmed the TV version of The Shining that came out in the
Yes.
late '90s at the Stanley Hotel, and you're right, it does have a very different kind of like exterior look than the overlook in Kubrick's movie. The exteriors were shot at a place called Timberline Lodge in
Hmm.
Oregon, and the interiors were based on another like resort hotel in the Pacific Northwest. I don't have the name in front of me, but
Yeah.
so yeah, they're like it's kind of this like amalgam of like these places when you combine like the book and the movie. Um, have you seen that '90s miniseries, by the way?
I have not. No, I've never watched it. I need to. I need to add that to the list.
So I remember watching that like as it aired. I think I was like, oh man, I don't know. I have to like look up. I was probably in high school, like probably like early high school, I think, when that aired. But that was a like a King approved kind of like version
Yeah.
of The Shining, and I remember like that's when I first became aware of like the controversy around the Kubrick version and how much King hated it.
Yeah.
Is that something you're like you kind of like have tapped into at all over the years? Is
Definitely. Yeah,
things
I'm a
like this
huge
movie?
Stephen King fan. I've read several of his books and I love a lot of his adaptations that have been made into movies. And sort of, yeah, I knew sort of some of the backlash. And my take is like ultimately Stephen King sold the rights to the movie,
Mhm.
like to the book. So you can't really say anything once you've signed the dotted line. It is what it is. And I think at that time, um, he should have known what Kubrick may have wanted to do with it. Looking at some of his past movies and adaptations that he had done, and knew that he was going to take his own creative spin. And he did a really great job. And I've not read the Shining book, so I can't compare the two, even though there's a lot of argument between what's better. But I like the movie, and I like it as a stand. Even if it's different than the book, I really enjoy the movie. I like what Kubrick did with it. Um, I think it because it was autobiographical in nature, and Stephen King sort of put himself in that role of Jack Torrance in a lot of ways. And I believe that in the book, Jack is more of a hero, and in the movie he's obviously not. And
Mhm.
maybe he didn't like that because that was a reflection of himself, and he doesn't want to see himself as like the bad guy. So I can see where he didn't like that take
Yeah.
on the movie. What about
I
you?
it's been many years since I've read the book, but that's my recollection of the book is kind of that like Jack is sort of like a victim of like
Yeah.
his alcoholism, and he's like he definitely is a complicated character, like a lot of characters in King novels, but he's not like he's more nuanced in the book. It's not like a sort of like psychotic villain character that you see in the movie. And that was part of King's original objection had to do with the casting of Nicholson
Yeah.
in that role because King was concerned that Nicholson coming off of this was several years prior, but One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, very iconic
Hmm.
role where he plays a patient in a mental hospital.
Yeah.
King was concerned that like that's what people would identify him with in the movie, and of course, like it's a classic sort of like unhinged Nicholson
Hmm.
performance. I sort of like understand King's point there, but that's not the movie that Kubrick set out to make. And I agree with
Yeah.
your point that like you sell the rights. It's the director's artistic vision.
Yeah. What do you feel like out of the Stephen King novels that have been made into movie? I mean, there's a huge list of them, but I feel like this is probably I think that like at the end of the day, Kubrick has made this book even more popular because I'm sure people watched the movie and then went to go buy the book. So like I think that on a scale of Stephen King novels that have been made into movies, this is like at the top of that list. Obviously, there's like things like Shawshank and It
Yeah,
and I mean, there's just so many. But really, I
Carrie.
think Oh yeah, Carrie too, and
Yeah.
but I think this is like really like the top of that top of that list. So I think you should thank Kubrick honestly
Yeah.
for
I
making this story what it's become.
I don't think there's any love lost between between Stephen King
Yeah,
and Stanley Kubrick. I think I honestly like just kind of looking at some of the things King has said about
yeah,
Doctor Sleep. I think that he kind of like held like continued to hold that
some
grudge against
grudge.
Kubrick for a
Yeah,
long time, which is his right.
yeah,
I
totally.
suppose. But I agree that like this movie like certainly like it's among the most watched like King adaptations ever. I would think it's
Yeah.
certainly and you named the others that I would kind of like put in that category, like among the best King adaptations. Like as a movie, it
Hmm.
works incredibly well as a movie, and people will argue over the adaptation,
Yeah.
of course, until the end of time. But like I think the movie is sort of undeniable.
And what kind of a cool thing too is Stephen King is also like known for writing novels that take place where you live, like in New England
Hmm.
states, Maine, New Hampshire. And I think what's cool about this one is that it does take place in Colorado.
Yep.
He could have wrote this story in Vermont or I don't know somewhere up in New England in a mountain, and he didn't because he did obviously visit the Stanley in Colorado. So I like that it's a different setting than we normally see from Stephen King.
Yeah, my recollection is that, and someone I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong, in the comments or via, direct message on Instagram if I'm wrong. But my recollection is that like the Torrance family has some in the book has some connection
Oh, really?
to Derry, or like one of
Okay.
the towns that kind of like fictional towns that King sort of like made up in New
Interesting.
England. And I believe the epilogue of the novel takes place in Maine. The
Oh,
surviving characters have like
okay.
relocated. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. It is sort of like a different type of setting than like especially like the early King novels, which were really sort of like, um, like based around that sort of like familiar sort of like New England, um, like New England, area. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about some of the alternate casting potential for Jack Torrance. Apparently, Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, and Harrison Ford were all up for the role of Jack. Do you think any of them would have had a like compelling take on this
Yeah, I didn't
character?
know that. So this was when I saw your notes here, I was kind of surprised. I definitely don't see Robin Williams. I just don't think a comedic actor would have played the role very well, even though he does have a dark side, as we've talked about in past movies we've covered.
This would have
And
been really early for like dramatic Robin Williams
yeah,
too. Like I
yeah,
don't
I
think
guess
it like
got
this would have like this is years before, or at least a few years before, like Dead Poet Society, among
yeah.
other kind of like dramatic performances.
1980, I would assume he was, but that's got to be close to like Mork and Mindy, though.
Yeah,
At least the late 70s. So it's still funny. Robin Williams. Harrison Ford, I think, is too all American, good looking. He's too good looking, honestly, for this role. I think what Jack Nicholson does really well, and he just has great facial expressions, but like there's a dark side of him. I do think De Niro could have pulled off this role.
hmm
It would have been very interesting to see him, and I think out of that list, I could see him sort of portraying Jack Torrance in the movie
yeah.
pretty well.
I tend to agree. I think, I mean, De Niro in 1980, I think definitely could have pulled off that sort of like dark, kind of like Jekyll and Hyde
Yeah,
vibe. It's so hard to picture. It's such an iconic
yeah,
performance. It's so hard to picture anyone besides besides Nicholson in the movie. Um, Also, like the idea of tying up like this, I mean, similar to other Kubrick movies, like this movie had principal photography lasted over a year.
yeah,
It was apparently a very grueling shoot. Kubrick is known for being very demanding on his actors and like just doing like take after take after take after
yeah.
take. Um, Nicholson apparently was on board, but it's kind of hard to imagine either of those other guys sort of like being like tied up for that long.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Harrison Ford maybe too grumpy to ever sit through that kind of process.
And this was in the midst of Star Wars too, so like
Yeah, yeah,
goodbye, I guess probably would have impacted both like Empire and Jedi probably if
yeah.
he had been involved.
No, I think Jack Nicholson has such a great kind of a weird, like dark comedic timing with certain things. And there's things in this movie that he says that are not meant to be funny, but I laugh out loud at. Um, Honestly, just his distaste for his wife Wendy in the movie throughout the whole film just kind of makes me chuckle. But Yeah, I really can't imagine anyone else. And I don't think I sort of looked into a little bit of maybe who they were looking for Wendy, but it really was Shelley Duvall like all along. That's really who Kubrick wanted for the film.
Yeah, and she's I think, when the movie came out, the reviews were kind of mixed,
Yeah,
and it was, kind of the conventional wisdom was that like Shelley Duvall was kind of like the weak link, like her
yeah,
performance was not appreciated at the time. But I think in hindsight, it's a lot better. As I've gotten older, I've sort of like grown to appreciate it a little bit more. Also, like she apparently had like a very very difficult time on
yeah,
this movie, and there are all sorts of stories about how Kubrick was like basically like abusive, like
yeah,
mentally to Shelley Duvall on this movie, and she passed away about a year or so ago, and there were a lot of stories that came out, around the time of her death and before about how um, it, this movie kind of like killed her career in some way. Like she didn't
hmm,
want to like go back to acting,
yeah,
and she had like this kind of head of steam, in the '70s, and was a very um, you know, kind of like actor on the rise. And then
hmm.
it kind of like this movie sort of like put things to a halt. And I think it was because of her experience on this movie, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of mixed things about that, and obviously a lot of it's alleged. I've seen some clips from behind the scenes, and Kubrick has always been like he's respectful but also kind of demanding, as I think many directors probably are, and his sort of process. And I think they actually won some like Guinness World Records on this movie. I read takes that they did 180
Hmm.
something takes at times, and um the scene with Danny and Dick sitting in the kitchen talking, I think that was one of the ones that they did like over 150 takes for, and
Yep.
she obviously was met with a lot of that too, and I can understand how that would just be a terrible, terrible experience. But also, you again, you kind of know going into Kubrick, he's gonna make you do take after take after take, and I don't know. I don't know if it led to her downfall necessarily, or maybe she had her own personal demons going on, but it certainly was after this movie that she kind of, yeah, didn't do as many big things, and
Yeah.
yeah, people like to
One.
read into it, I'm sure, just from the movie itself, but I don't
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's yeah. I mean, it's impossible to know for sure. I really like her performance though, and I like her,
Yeah, I do too,
in the
which
movie.
makes me laugh.
Um, what do you think of Jake Lloyd as Danny in the movie? As a kid performance, like how does this rate?
Yeah, is it Jake or Jack Lloyd?
Jack Lloyd, like I could
I
be
think it's
wrong.
Jack, yeah,
Jack
which
Lloyd.
I thought was funny that, like, Jack or I'm sorry, it's Danny Lloyd plays Danny Torrance and Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, which I think is
You're right.
funny that their first names are their first names in the movie, which is maybe meant to be. But
Danny Lloyd.
I
Yeah, you're right.
I love Danny's performance. I'm usually turned off by kids in movies, and they usually ruin a movie for me. And I think both in this movie and even in Doctor Sleep, which we'll talk about, I like the kids, and I think he did a really great job. Only annoying thing was like the little finger, thing that he did. I
It's
think
so
which
it's
was
so
like
weird.
specific.
It's like very creepy.
Yeah, it kind of just annoys me when he does that. But other than that, I think his performance was really great. I did read that they did not tell him he was making a horror movie. He was obviously young at the time. He thought he was making a drama, but
Yeah.
I'm looking at some of the scenes. And I'm like, man, this kid had to have like known a little bit because there's
Yeah.
some, yeah,
I've always wondered the same thing. Like, how do you convince him you're not in a horror movie when he's like, like saying like, red rum and like, I
yeah,
mean, it's like it's very, um, you can shield him from like the violence, I think
yeah.
to a certain extent, but like
Yeah, and I was thinking the scene with the axe and his dad, like he wasn't there. He was outside of the hotel, or he wasn't even there probably for filming of that because he had already escaped through the bathroom window. But so you didn't see maybe Jack Nicholson in some of these like really horrifying moments. But yeah, he did some weird shit that I feel like
yeah,
he like had to have known. Maybe just forgot about it. Who knows?
yeah, blocked it out of his out of his memory. Yeah, I think as a kid performance, I think it's pretty good. Like kid performances are tough.
Yeah.
But obviously like it's essential to the movie. I do like the idea of Kubrick like protecting him
Hmm.
from like, some of the
Yeah.
like more traumatic, like scary stuff, but I don't know how like real that is. But there's something kind of like because Kubrick is so like, as we've talked about, like he's so notoriously like hard on his
Yeah.
actors. There's something kind of nice about like just like the idea of him like being protective of this kid, but
Yeah.
I mean, who
That was
knows
nice.
if that's real or not. Um, what are some of your favorite kind of like moments or scenes from The Shining?
Oh gosh, there's a lot. I mean, I think this movie lends itself to like every shot you can almost screen grab, and I love this movie visually. Um, there's great music. There's great sound.
Hmm.
There's a scene that Danny's riding his bike over the carpet and then hardwood, and he's kind of going back and forth through the hallways, and you almost hear like kind of a heartbeat in that, and
Hmm.
that kind of comes back to play in this movie and in Doctor Sleep. You hear that heartbeat, which I assume is like the house, like or not the
Hmm.
house, the hotel is kind of alive, and you're hearing that. But uh, that's just such an iconic scene, and I think other than that, I love the opening scene of the movie when
Yeah,
you have this. I would. It's not a drone, I'm sure, a helicopter, whatever they
helicopter.
shot it.
Yeah,
Yeah, at the time, over the lake, and the music is just. You're immediately like, oh, this is gonna be scary. Like it just immediately puts you in the mood of this is a horror movie, and there's a lot of horror movies that I love that kind of start out with that big kind of bang and noise, and um, I've seen other directors sort of take that same similar note. And then yeah, the maze scene at the end of
yeah,
the movie, I think when Danny's being chased by Jack, I think is pretty horrifying and uh, very spooky and scary. And I love just the setting of that in the winter with the snow and yeah, it's very you're disoriented. You don't know where they are, where he is, where Jack is, and it's really cool.
yeah. That maze scene is very intense. Like it holds up very well today, even after rewatching this movie so many times. It's still very like genuinely suspenseful. It's
Yeah.
a really good set piece. I love the way that they kind of like foreshadow it throughout the movie. With you get these
Hmm.
kind of like different views of the hedge maze, sort of like throughout the
Yeah.
film, and you're kind of like expecting it to climax there,
Hmm.
and it really does pay off. I think it's interesting what you said about like the start of the movie being like immediately disconcerting, and
Hmm.
like I wonder like why that is because I mean I think the answer is the music. Like the music
Yeah.
really adds a lot to it. But like there's just like helicopter shots of Glacier National Park
It's
is what
supposed to
we're
be beautiful. Yeah.
looking at. It's like it's one of the like it's incredibly beautiful. It
Yeah.
like if you set it to a different piece of music, it could be in like a National Geographic documentary
Yeah.
that wouldn't scare you at all.
Yeah.
But like you instead you have this like foreboding score.
Yeah.
And like the way the credits appear too, like the
Hmm.
titles are just like it's just kind of like very in your face, and
Yeah.
um it does immediately kind of like set you on your heels a little bit. It's a very very
Definitely.
good opening.
Yeah, it's great. I think, maybe I think Kubrick was going for showing how vast the forest was and the mountains and there's nothing out there and they were going to
Yep.
be here alone and he kind of shows you that by showing you some of the scenery um of the forest and mountains. But yeah, it's just so great. And one of my other like I really like Insidious as a horror film.
Hmm.
It starts off same thing. It not scene wise, but like music just right off the bat. That's just eerie and just like oh, it just sends a shiver down your spine almost.
Yep.
And kind of sets the tone. But yeah, I love that. What about you? What are some of your favorite scenes from the movie?
So I also love the stuff with Danny riding his little
Yeah,
what is that, like a big wheel like bicycle
yeah. I think a
or
big
whatever.
wheel is what they call them.
I love that, like all that Steadicam stuff is really good.
Yeah.
It's really like kind of a very interesting way of kind of like immersing you into the movie. And this is one of the
Hmm.
first movies to be shot with a Steadicam, at least to that extent. Um, I love that like that technique is repeated in that like climactic like axe wielding scene where you see like
Yeah.
the tracking of the axe itself like across the screen.
Hmm.
That's one of like that's probably like my favorite like single shot in the movie. It's just like I just think that's so cool. And I saw this movie in the theater a few years ago, and like seeing that like on the big screen is just like a very cool experience. So
That's
um,
awesome.
highly recommend seeing The Shining in a theater if you have the chance. The other scene I love is the scene after the long scene between Jack Nicholson and the bartender, the Grady character, the
Yeah.
ghost Grady. Um, there's like that spill on Nicholson's coat or whatever, and they go into
Yeah.
the men's room, and that like just like the production design of that
Yeah.
room, I think it's so cool.
Very creepy.
And Nicholson's performance in that scene where he's just like so confused, and it's kind of like dawns on him gradually,
Mhm.
sort of what's happening, and he sort of like recognizes his own sort of like descent into insanity. It's
Yeah.
like I love that scene, and
Yeah.
just like really good writing too. Like the line like it's like you've always been the caretaker or whatever the line. I think
Yeah.
is really great.
I actually have that line written down because I've always been a little bit confused, and I kind of dug into this, and there's so many theories out there. Well, first of all, they say in the beginning of the movie that the hotel is built on an Indian burial
Yeah.
ground, so it already lends itself to maybe some haunting things happening. And there's obviously a lot of darkness and things that have happened that were very very terrible. But when he says that to Jack, and he says, "You've always been the caretaker," we see at the end of the movie a picture of the Overlook on July 4th, and Jack is in that picture. I always read that to mean that this is a photo of maybe all the lives that the hotel has taken. They're sort
Hmm.
of stuck forever there. But then also there's a lot of back and forth, and someone sort of explained that there's like two sides to everyone, and you know Jack, there's a part of him that has always been a part of this hotel, and Danny, and we can talk about this as we start to talk about Doctor Sleep, but his shine is that he has a lot of different abilities. One of them is, I think, is like seeing the past or seeing the
Hmm.
future. And he sort of foreshadows a lot of the stuff they see. But yeah, it's just a line that always kind of confused me a little bit. And maybe they put that in there for a reason, but I don't know if like Jack is truly part of this history of this hotel, or if it was just him sort of persuading him in this moment to really take on this new side of him, the dark side of him that he's sort of always had. Um, but yeah, it's just something I need to dig a little deeper on and
Yeah.
give some thought to.
So I can't explain the picture. I think the picture
Yeah,
is sort of like a Kubrick thing, just kind of like a weird way to end the movie. But I take
yeah,
that line to mean you've always been the caretaker, to
yeah.
just to be like the hotel kind of like pushing Jack like
Okay, yeah,
towards this like inevitable moment where he's gonna
yeah,
like murder his family, because like that's what the caretaker does. The caretaker,
yeah,
like Grady murders his family.
yeah. He murders his family.
You've always been the caretaker. This is your destiny. You can't
Yeah.
escape it. And I think that's sort of an idea that's like repeated in Doctor Sleep in a lot of
Hmm.
ways through. Um, there's this great scene with Dick and Danny, an adult Danny talking about with like the ghost of the ghost
Hmm.
of Dick, and there's this great line where Dick says, "You just walked into my kitchen one day, and I've been on the hook ever since." And it's like
Yeah,
there's this idea that you can't escape these things that are like
yeah.
happening to you like in this world, and there's something like permanent about like these
Hmm.
ghostly states,
Yeah.
and you just sort of have to like reckon with them as as you go.
Yeah, and I think something that I always took note of is that I think with the hotel, the obviously with Jack, his demons were alcohol, likely women. He was a womanizer. You kind of clearly see that. And I think the his demons inside were those two things, and you see that with like the bartender teasing
Hmm.
him with the alcohol and a drink, and he obviously accepts that. And then this woman in the room that appears as a beautiful naked woman in the bathtub, and then all of a sudden she changes into this
Hmm.
horrifying old lady. Um, but what's weird to me is like Danny kind of he he lives with his father's demons like forever. Like even as an adult, he is still haunted by his dad's demons. I don't think they're his. I don't think they're Danny's. I think they're his father's somehow. And yeah, it's just a weird connection, and I again want to dig into it a little bit more and try to figure out this sort of deep root. And maybe I need to read the books. That's something that may be more explained in there. But yeah, I noticed that in Doctor Sleep, like he's still seeing these apparitions, and they're of his dad's demons, not his.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Um,
that scene, I mean, one of my favorite scenes in Doctor Sleep, and we can kind of transition into talking
yeah.
about that movie. I think is there's this moment towards the end of the film where adult Danny, played by Ewan McGregor, has a encounter in that bar at the
Hmm.
Overlook that mirrors Nicholson's
Yeah.
encounter in The Shining with the Grady
Mhm.
character, and you have Danny kind of like recognizing his father in that
Yeah.
character and talking to him as his father, and it's an actor who kind of looks a little bit like Jack Nicholson, and
Mhm.
the viewer
Yeah.
is like kind of made to understand like this is that guy, and that scene apparently is an invention of Mike Flanagan.
Okay.
Not part of it's not that's not part of Doctor Sleep.
Okay.
Um, because of course, like I mean, this is a good point I think to kind of talk about like the big differences in adaptations here. That at the end of The
Yeah.
Shining, the book, the hotel is destroyed.
Mm.
So there's no Overlook Hotel in Doctor
Gotcha.
Sleep. Like the characters
Okay.
never go there because the hotel was blown up
Destroyed.
by these boilers, at
Yeah.
the end of the book. So like the really cool thing about Doctor Sleep is that it gives King like that ending that he always wanted in the filmed version of The
Mhm.
Shining, but it also kind of like this new invents this new way of doing it for people who are like only familiar with with Kubrick's
Yeah.
movie, because of course you expect to see all the Shining imagery.
Yeah.
So I just think that's like a really cool way of adapting it and like kind of pleasing everyone, but that specific scene kind of underscores the idea of Doctor Sleep being about like Danny kind of uh, like reckoning with his father's history
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a pretty major way.
I mean, he is his father's son, and
Yeah,
he's an alcoholic himself. We find out in Doctor Sleep, and um, is haunted by his own things, and yeah, maybe it's in his blood. Maybe and I've even thought like, what if Jack had a shine that we didn't know about? Because it does say like the hotel feeds off, especially of those that shine. Dick has obviously shining abilities. So does Dan. Danny's is really strong. Um, but maybe there was something with Jack too. Maybe he had something that we didn't know about, and that's why it was really strong with him and pulled him in so much. Because the mom didn't like she
yeah,
doesn't have a shine or anything, but we don't really see any history with her as far as darkness or anything like that. But
yeah.
yeah,
There's a line in Doctor Sleep where Danny and Abra are talking, and Abra, the one of the like the protagonists of Doctor Sleep, the how old is she? So like junior high, high school
yeah, she's like
age, probably.
13, 14. Yeah.
And she's just kind of coming to terms with like her shining abilities, and she
Mhm.
asks adult Danny, if other people can do that. And Danny has this great line, well, everyone has it to a certain ability.
Oh, yeah, okay,
It's
I
like,
missed that, yeah.
yeah, he compares it to like the husband who brings home flowers for his wife who doesn't,
Yeah,
know that she had a hard day, but like, like that sort of
yeah.
thing. So yeah, I think
When I
there's
t
probably an element of shine to like all these
Ye
characters probably in a certain way.
Totally, and actually, I just thought of something that kind of leads me to believe that maybe Jack did, is there's a scene where Jack is talking to Wendy in their bed, and she's feeding him breakfast, and he says, like, "I have deja vu, like, even when I was getting a tour, I felt like I've
Hmm.
been here before," and so maybe that was foreshadowing that he had some sort of ability, and maybe he'd seen it in a vision or something in the past.
Yeah, for sure. I think
Yeah.
that's a good detail to kind of look out to. Um, okay, so Doctor Sleep,
Yeah.
2019, Mike Flanagan. I know you're a big Flanagan
I
fan. You've
am.
talked
I
about,
love Flanagan.
yeah. What were your what are your feelings on this? It's a kind of controversial movie. There's certainly a contingent of folks who just like don't like it at all, who think it's
Yeah.
kind of like lesser Flanagan. I think it's like the best movie Flanagan's made for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah.
And is kind of up there with his like TV work, his Netflix stuff.
Mhm.
Um, what are your overall just thoughts on Doctor Sleep?
I loved it. And I think it came out at a really bad time, 2019. I think just probably, I don't know if this was pre or post COVID, but it didn't do well in theaters. I do remember that. It didn't perform very well. But I liked it the first time I saw it. I loved it the second time I watched it. It's a movie that each time I watch it, I kind of grow to love more and more. And recently, just preparing for this podcast, I watched and have seen the extended version with deleted scenes, and it's really great. And I think the scenes definitely add a ton to the story and to the film.
Hmm.
But I love it. I'm a huge Flanagan fan. I think there's like the dreaminess that he sort of brings into a lot of his films. It looks very different. If you're expecting a Kubrick movie, like you're not going to get that with this. But I think it's a really great part to The Shining and explaining what the shine is, because that's such a big part of it's the unknown of The Shining, and we kind of get a bit more of an explanation in this movie of what it is and how it affects different people, because different people have different abilities with their
Mhm.
shine, as we see. Um, I don't know. What about you? What's your take on the film?
I love it. I saw it in theater, when it came out, and I thought, I think the theatrical cut's, like, pretty good. Like, there's a lot of people who are
Yeah.
kinda, like, down on the theatrical cut and say, like, you really need to see the director's cut. The director's
Mhm.
cut is much better, I think,
Yeah.
than the theatrical cut. It really just adds a lot of depth to everything,
Hmm.
in the movie, but I'm not one of these people who thinks, like, the theatrical cut is, like, should be totally discarded.
No, not at all.
I like both versions quite a bit, but I think the longer cut, the 3-hour cut is,
Yeah.
just like it's just really great.
Yeah.
And, uh, I like your take that it kinda just, like, adds a little bit more detail into, like, what The Shining is, like, for these
Hmm.
characters, and, um like, to me, the movie sort of revolves around the Rose the Hat character, and I
Yeah.
think, like, Rebecca Ferguson's performance as Rose the Hat is, it's just, like, one of the great kind of, like, movie villains,
Yeah.
ever. She's this, like,
She's pretty great.
kinda, like, weird immortal cult leader,
Yeah.
and, I think that's, very cool character, very menacing, also very appealing, and the way that the movie kind of, like, presents these characters' abilities, Rose's abilities and Abra's abilities to kind of like get inside each other's heads.
Hmm.
I just think it's like incredibly cool. And um, it takes a lot for like a 3-hour movie to kind of like keep you like on the edge of your seat, so to speak, like
Yeah.
for the entire length of time. But there's a certain inventiveness in the way Flanagan presents these concepts that does it.
Well, and they're also in like these chapters, right, throughout the
Yeah.
movie. And I really like that. And they sort of, yeah, there's an excitement that keeps going in each chapter. You're never really bored. And I do think a 3-hour movie sounds daunting, but the scenes that were added in the director's cut, I think just add so much to the story. They add a lot to the characters, especially Abra too. There's a lot that they cut out in the theatrical version. I think what they added in explains her uniqueness a lot.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's great if you if you want to set aside 3 hours. It's a really really great watch, especially if you're a fan of The Shining. Um, and yeah, it's kind of the only way I want to watch the movie going forward is with those added scenes.
Yeah. Is Doctor Sleep like kind of in the like horror movie rotation for you? Like,
Yeah,
is it like
it
an
totally is.
annual? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an annual watch, just like The Shining is now. It's in the rotation. We tend to watch it. I'm again a huge Mike Flanagan fan, and so I tend to go through at least one or two of his shows during sort of the month of October. And you just went back through Bly Manor. I like Midnight Mass. Huge Haunting of Hill House. That's like my favorite. And I think what's kind of interesting is we see a lot of the Flanagan likes to use a lot of the same actors across the
Yeah.
board, and we see several of them in Doctor Sleep. Henry Thomas, who people might know from E.T., he was the kid in E.T. He's done a lot of other stuff too, but he's in a lot of Flanagan movies and shows, and he's in here playing Jack, the sort of modern version of Jack that we see.
Yep.
And Danny's mom is also an actress that was in a lot of the movies, and the little girl at the very beginning of Doctor Sleep that gets killed she's plays Nell in Haunting of Hill House too.
Hmm.
But yeah, I just noticed, and I actually noticed more people now that I was paying attention to it that were previously in Flanagan projects, which is cool.
Yeah, Flanagan's great, and I love the way he kind of like reuses, like he goes back to these people who
Yeah,
he's like obviously has like a good working relationship with, Bruce Greenwood, is another one,
yeah,
who's very kind of important in his filmography, who appears in Doctor Sleep. Um, yeah, it my favorite Flanagan piece is Midnight Mass,
yeah,
the Netflix series. Like I think that's just like such a cool immersive story.
yeah. It's great.
Really good. Have you seen Gerald's Game? The
I have not. That's one that I actually have not watched.
Yeah. We're just a blanket recommendation to folks.
Yeah,
Gerald's Game is really good. Worth watching. Another Stephen King adaptation. It's on Netflix. It was produced for Netflix, I believe. So yeah, go watch
and
Gerald's Game.
maybe what led to the relationship between Flanagan and King to give him the power to make this movie, because I'm sure because of past experiences Stephen King was probably hesitant to write, send over those rights to the book. and wanted it done right. And having worked with him on it, right? Because didn't he do it? Was Flanagan? I don't know if that actually. Now that I think about it, maybe Flanagan wasn't.
Yeah, no, Flanagan, I think he maybe was a producer on
Okay.
it, but he didn't
He
direct
didn't direct it. Okay.
the It
Felt a little
movies.
Flanagan-y, but
No, they certainly definitely, I mean, I think like a
yeah,
lot of he definitely has like a style that is kind of like repeated by like he figured something out, I think,
yeah,
like stylistically. And like we were talking just in Slack, recently about the Salem's Lot um
yeah,
adaptation that just hit
yeah.
HBO Max, which is not good. But like it also has like a very kind of
Flanagan
like
feel.
yeah, it has like kind of
Yeah,
like not in a good way, I would argue. Like it's sort of like Flanagan light. It's sort of like has the like aesthetic of Flanagan, but none of the
hmm
like depth of a Flanagan project.
yeah.
So
Are there any big scenes from Doctor Sleep that are your favorite out of that movie?
well, I mean, so there's that scene I mentioned with Dick and Danny,
Yeah,
talk. I love anytime Dick makes an appearance.
yeah.
I think it's really great. The actor, I don't have his name in front of me,
I
but
don't either.
the guy who plays,
Looks just like him, by the way.
yeah,
Yeah.
very good likeness to Scatman Crothers, from the original film. But I love that relationship between
hmm
it's sort of like a sort of like replaces like the father son relationship, I think.
I think so. Yeah,
Uh,
totally.
so I love any scene where Dick pops up. I also I think the ending is really great. Like I
Yeah,
think kind of like working in like the original, like a version of the original ending from the book.
yeah. 'Cause that's
Um
what everyone wants, right? Everyone wants him to go back to the
yeah,
hotel.
everyone wants him to go back. It's building towards this kind of like going back to the Overlook kind of
Yeah.
moment. And like they nail it. And apparently King was satisfied with this, like, and he's spoken very highly of Doctor Sleep
Yeah.
in the past. So, um, you know, being able to please Stephen King when in a movie adaptation, I think is like that means something because he's been critical, obviously, of The Shining, which we've discussed, but like
Yeah,
been critical of other adaptations, throughout his career as well. So,
totally.
I just think like the end, like the final set piece is really well staged. It has just the right amount of like fan service,
Mhm.
you have, Ewan McGregor kind of like going through the hotel and like, sort of like re-experiencing some of the
Yeah.
things like he experienced as a kid and like seeing, like the door that's been chopped up by the axe and
Yeah.
other things. So like, um, normally I'm not into the fan service stuff, but I feel
Yeah.
like I'm such a big fan of The Shining. I think whatever. I'm a easy mark.
Yeah, totally, me too, and I think that was, definitely a highlight of the movie for me. I like what they did with these characters that were sort of haunting Danny, how he's able to lock them away, which he learns from Dick. Would have been super helpful for him to tell him that in the first movie, but
Yeah.
whatever. He shows him that he can sort of lock these characters that are haunting him in a box in his mind and they won't bother him again. And so he sort of goes through and you see at the end he has a lot of these sort of caskets almost that are locked away in his mind and then he lets them all out. And
Hmm.
at the end we see them all kind of come back to fruition in the hotel. Um I do really like this scene. I don't It's weird saying I like this scene from the movie, but it's very scary. It's very terrible, but when this cult group sort of kills the little baseball boy,
Hmm.
it's so scary and I really don't like when like kids are like killed in movies. It's just can be hard to watch and it is hard to watch in a lot of ways, but I think it's like really shows you how terrifying this group is and what they're capable of. Um and I mean, they really show you that from the beginning with the little girl they go after, but they
Hmm.
don't show her dying. They just kind of they cut the scene. So you don't really know what happened to her, but now you fully see what they're doing and they really just torture kids, especially kids because their shine is so bright. Um it's just a really terrifying scene. And little Jacob was his name Tremblay or I can't remember his proper name. He's been in a bunch of movies, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's a terrifying scene of the
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very it's kind of it's tough to watch. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like that's what you get in a horror movie. I
Yeah.
think like this is you're gonna have like a handful of scenes that are just like really unnerving and disconcerting.
Yeah.
But I love those like the overhead shots, like the drone shots of the like their caravan kind of like
Yeah.
going in and out of this like ethanol,
Plant.
production
Yeah.
facility or whatever. And it's like it's just a very well executed scene. And
Yeah.
yeah, like you get a little bit more. It's sort of like just like background information on like what
Hmm.
these characters do, and like you get that throughout the movie. Like there's all these little kind of like asides about their like their immortality, like or
Hmm.
like near immortality. That's kind of like interesting. Like they refer to themselves as gods.
Yeah.
The handful of times it kind of makes me want not that would be like a great, standard to set, but like I'd be up for watching like a Mike Flanagan series on like this cult, like a
Yeah.
prequel series that follows like, Rose the Hat through the centuries or something.
Hmm.
Like that would be kind of fun.
Yeah.
Um, Otherwise, I
That
don't
would
know
be
that we
cool.
need to return to this world
Yeah.
again. But yeah, more Rose the
Yeah.
Hat. I'm
More
down for
Rose the
that.
Hat. She's awesome. Yeah, I love the scenes with her and Abra, um, playing with each other's minds, and she's in her mind, and then it's just kind of a back and forth. And clearly, Abra is very, very powerful, even though she doesn't quite know the abilities that she has yet. It's really smartly written and performed, and just kind of a great like kind of cat and mouse almost a bit with the
Yep.
two of them throughout the movie. But yeah, I think it ends in the best way possible back at the hotel, back where it all started, in a lot of ways. So,
Yep.
yeah, it's so cool to see Danny walking through those halls and the lights are sort of illuminating as he's walking through, and it's so creepy. And now
Yep.
there's even like there's cobwebs and it's like deteriorated, so it's even more scary,
Yeah.
scary than The Shining in a way because it's truly disgusting and dark and yeah, it's pretty freaky.
Yeah. No, they do a nice job of kind of like recreating that kind of like the vibe of the overlook from the Kubrick movie. And
Yeah,
yeah, they did a really nice job with that. And it's
yeah,
like the degree of difficulty I think on this adaptation is just like through the roof.
yeah,
So like it's a fascinating movie for that reason, just because of the way that like I said, Flanagan sort of like threads the needle and gives Kubrick fans what they want, and fans of the novel and
hmm,
and King himself, what everyone wants. So that's
yeah,
very rare that everyone kind of like gets to feel
yeah,
like they've won,
yeah.
on something like this. So um before we go, Kat, obviously you're a horror movie fan. This episode's going to drop on Halloween. Any other like horror movie recs or like good
Oh my
double
gosh.
features with The Shining and Doctor Sleep, which is obviously like it's a double feature unto itself, but like
Yeah.
what would be a good like companion piece to
Oh, a
these
companion
two?
piece. I think now that I really paid a lot of close attention to this movie, I would say go and watch like Jordan Peele's movies like Nope and Get Out. I think they had this like subtleness, but still kind of horror to them that I feel like The Shining has, and it's not so like out loud.
Hmm.
And I love Jordan Peele's movies. And I just rewatched Us too,
Yeah,
which is
us is
only the
really good.
second time. Yeah, and I think they're all really great. But I sort of noticed some similarities between Nope and sort of the blood scene of the home and then
Oh
the
yeah.
blood that we see. So I think like honestly, I think Jordan takes a lot of stuff from other directors and movies. Um, but yeah, that would be a good one. And then I love, man, I love so many scary movies, but I'm a big I love Insidious. I
Hmm.
don't think the sequels are worth watching personally, but that first Insidious movie is really really good. And so scary and eerie and yeah, just a great Halloween scary movie watch, I think.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Insidious. I agree the sequels aren't really all that great, but
Yeah.
yeah, the first one, definitely worth watching.
Yeah.
Um, I would recommend if you're a fan of The Shining and Doctor Sleep too, but I'll recommend a movie. I don't know if you've seen this, Cat. Have you seen Room 237, the documentary?
No. No, I
So
haven't.
this is a documentary. I love this movie. It's a like on the surface, it would seem to be a documentary about The Shining,
Yeah.
but it's not. It's
Mm.
actually a movie that is kind of about like conspiracy theories that are like
Oh,
spun out of The Shining.
okay.
And it's like a really good companion piece to the movie, because like it shows like clips from the movie and basically just like it's very simple. It's like people talking over clips from the movie, explaining their just like crazy, insane theories about
Wow.
The Shining. It's almost like a movie version of like a podcast. Like it's kind of
Okay.
like it's like if this podcast went on another like 3 hours, like we would get into like our own like, theories about The Shining. But it's like, it's truly insane. It's really a movie that's like, it uses The Shining as like a jumping off point for like
Okay.
all these like obsessive fandom and like the idea of like how people get these like weird sort of like notions in their head. I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. There's one guy, in the movie who describes The Shining as an admission and apology by Kubrick that he like was responsible for faking the moon landing, which is like a long held sort of like
Yeah.
conspiracy idea that like Kubrick shot the footage that we all saw
Yeah.
of the Apollo astronauts landing on the moon, and they're like all these. It's like diagrammed out in the movie. Like they're all
Yeah.
these
Isn't Danny's wearing like a rocket?
an
Like he's
Apollo
wearing- yeah.
sweatshirt and like
Yeah.
there's like all these things, and like you watch the movie and you think like, oh, I kind of understand like why they think that, and
Yeah.
then you like simultaneously are like, this is absolutely like batshit insane.
Well,
So,
I love a good conspiracy theory, so I will. I'll give it a watch.
listen, you got to be careful about the conspiracy theories you adopt in today's day and age. But
Yeah.
Room 237 is a fascinating film. Don't go into it expecting like behind the scenes like info on like the making of The Shining or anything. It's really not
Yeah.
about The Shining. It's like wrapped up in The Shining, but what it's really about is like these like crazy ideas that come out of like fandom. But it's a
Yeah.
cool companion piece.
I'll have to add that one.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I was just thinking with Insidious, just literally thought about this. There's a lot of similarities because in Insidious, the father is sort of dealing with his own past and sort of demons, if you will, that he's
Mhm.
dealing with, and his son has to like face them. And I also think Rose Byrne in that movie, she's kind of had this like haunting look about her that I feel is very similar to maybe like a Shelley Duvall. And then The Shining, they both kind of portray this sort of, I don't know, just kind of haunting female character. I don't know. There's like a couple of different similarities there.
I mean,
that I never
facing
really
your
thought about.
demons is like that's the trope of like a lot
Yeah,
of horror
yeah,
movies.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Totally.
I see what you're getting at. I mean, Insidious is just that's another like that's a future time on screen.
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
for
So
sure.
good.
I'd love to discuss that in more depth.
Is there any other movies on your list?
I mean, I would say just like other Flanagan movies.
Yeah.
Or Flanagan projects, like mostly his TV work. I think is
Great. I do like Hush. I like that movie a lot.
Yeah, Hush is good.
Yeah.
I haven't rewatched that in quite.
I haven't
some time.
either. I've only seen it once, but I remember liking it quite a bit.
Yeah. And also like other other Kubrick movies. I think
Yeah.
that if you like sort of like the kind of like cool detached kind of like vibe of The Shining, like that's like Kubrick in a nutshell.
Yeah, 2001. Yeah.
I think that honestly, like Eyes Wide Shut is like a really good sort
You
of
sneak
like
that in there.
yeah. Listen, any chance I get, but like they both have this sort of kind of like detached, like foreboding kind
Yeah.
of quality to them, and like Eyes Wide Shut in a way is it's sort of paced like a horror movie.
Yeah.
And there are things that happen in that movie that are
Horrifying.
horrifying. Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, yeah. The 2-part Eyes Wide Shut solo pod coming at you at some point very soon.
Love it.
Yeah. Kat, thank you so much for talking to me about one of my favorite movies ever, The Shining, and also Doctor Sleep, which is a very good movie in its own right. I think a future classic, if not already.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun.
I vote that we take a trip and we go to the Stanley Hotel and we record a podcast live from.
Yeah. No, I'm down for that. Yeah.
In a haunted in the haunted section.
If there's a watch brand out there that wants to pay for that,
yeah,
get in touch with our partnerships team.
Yeah.
I think that would be a lot of fun. So
totally.
Thanks again, Kat. This has been great, and thanks to all of our time on screen listeners. We will be back next time with another movie, and we'll see you then. Thanks.
All right.